Have you ever witnessed an injustice so blatant, so infuriating you could feel your blood begin to boil? A moment where someone's arrogance and prejudice clouds their judgment, leading them to commit an act of profound cruelty. You're about to hear the story of Richard Davenport, a man who believed his wealth and status put him above everyone else. On a cross-country flight, he targeted a quiet black teenager, forcing him out of a first-class seat the boy was rightfully sitting in. But Richard had no idea that he had just made the single biggest mistake of his life, for the boy's mother was also on that plane, and she was a woman with the power to bring his entire world crashing down around him. The hum of the Boeing 727 was a familiar lullaby to Richard Davenport. It was the sound of success, the white noise of a life lived at 35,000 feet, shuttling between multi-million-dollar deals in New York and his sprawling Bel Air mansion in Los Angeles, as a senior vice president at Sterling Cooper Financial, one of the most ruthless private equity firms on Wall Street. Richard didn't just fly first class. He considered it his natural habitat. The plush leather of Seat 2A was not a luxury. It was a prerequisite, a throne from which he conducted his airborne affairs. Today, however, his sanctuary felt violated. He had just settled in the flight attendant, having taken his custom-ordered macchiato, when a young man shuffled past him and sank into Seat 2B. Richard did a subtle, almost imperceptible double-take. The boy was maybe 16, 17 at most. He was wearing a simple grey hoodie, the hood pulled down with a pair of high-end Bose headphones already clamped over his ears. His jeans were slightly faded, and his sneakers, though clean, were well worn. He was black. Richard's mind, a finely tuned machine for calculating risk and identifying assets that were out of place, immediately flagged the situation. He took a sip of his macchiato, the warmth doing nothing to quell the cold prickle of annoyance spreading through his chest. This has to be a mistake, he thought, his gaze flicking from the boy's simple attire to the polished mahogany trim of the first-class cabin. The boy, oblivious, pulled out a dog-eared paperback, something by Octavia Butler, and a sketchbook. He seemed entirely engrossed, his head bobbing slightly to a rhythm only he could hear. To Richard, this wasn't just a simple seating error. It was a breakdown of the natural order. First class was a meticulously curated environment. It was for people like him, people who had earned their place through ruthless ambition and 80-hour work weeks. It was for titans of industry, Hollywood producers, and the occasional political figure. It was not for this. He leaned slightly into the aisle, trying to catch the eye of the flight attendant, a young woman named Karen with a kind but harried smile. She was busy helping an elderly couple with their overhead luggage. Richard cleared his throat, a sharp, impatient sound. Karen glanced over her smile, faltering for a second. "Just a moment, sir," she said politely. Richard's patience was a finite resource, and it was already depleted from a brutal morning of negotiations that had nearly fallen through. He turned his attention back to the boy in 2B. The teenager, sensing a presence, finally looked up. He had soft, intelligent eyes and offered a small, hesitant smile before looking back down at his book. The smile, meant as a polite gesture, only solidified Richard's conviction. It was the smile of someone who knew they were in the wrong place, someone hoping not to be noticed. Richard saw weakness. He saw a trespasser. He didn't consider the possibility of a wealthy family, a gifted child being rewarded, or a dozen other perfectly plausible scenarios. His mind, steeped in the biases of his insulated world, had already written the story the kid had snuck up from economy. Or there was a ticketing error, and he was a problem that needed to be solved. And Richard Davenport was above all else a problem solver. "Excuse me." Richard said, his voice low, but carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. The boy, Jamal Hayes, pulled one side of his headphones off. "Sorry," he asked, his voice quiet. "I think you might be in the wrong seat," Richard stated, not as a question but as a fact. He gestured around the cabin with a sweep of his hand. "This is first class." Jamal blinked, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his boarding pass, the paper slightly crumpled. He smoothed it out and pointed a finger at the bold print. It says 2B. See?" He held it out for Richard to inspect. Richard didn't even glance at it. The flimsy piece of paper was irrelevant. "There's been a mistake," he insisted, his tone hardening. "These seats are reserved for our Platinum Tier members. Perhaps your seat is 22B, not 2B. Jamal's brow furrowed. He was a quiet kid, an honor student who preferred drawing in his sketchbook to arguing with adults. He knew his mother had booked this ticket for him as a special surprise, a graduation present for finishing high school a year early. He was on his way to visit his aunt in LA before starting a summer program at Caltech. He had never flown first class before and felt a little out of place, but he was certain he was in the right spot. "No, sir. I'm pretty sure this is it," Jamal said, trying to keep his voice steady. He tucked the boarding pass away, a clear signal he was done with the conversation. He put his headphone back on, hoping the gesture would be enough. It wasn't. For Richard, this was no longer about a simple seating issue. It was a matter of principle. It was about maintaining the sanctity of his space. He pressed the call button above his head with a firm, decisive jab. The light pinged on, and a moment later Karen, the flight attendant, scurried over. "Yes, Mr. Davenport. Is everything all right?" she asked, recognizing him from previous flights. He was a Diamond Medallion member, a classification that came with a file full of notes about his specific demands and notoriously short temper. "No, Karen. Everything is not all right," Richard said, his voice now loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. He gestured toward Jamal, who had once again removed his headphones, a look of weary apprehension on his face. "This young man appears to be lost. He's in a first-class seat, and I need you to rectify the situation immediately. It's making me, and I'm sure other passengers, uncomfortable." He had weaponized the word uncomfortable, turning his personal prejudice into a collective security concern. A few heads turned. An older woman in 3A clutched her pearls. A businessman across the aisle in 2D studiously ignored the entire interaction, staring intently at his laptop. The stage was set, and Richard Davenport was directing the play. Karen's professional smile was plastered on, but her eyes betrayed a rising panic. Dealing with a disgruntled Diamond Medallion member was one of the most stressful parts of her job. Mr. Davenport was known throughout the transcontinental aircrew as a cabin complainer, a passenger who could and would fire off a scathing email to corporate over the temperature of his coffee. A formal complaint from him could mean a disciplinary review for her. "Of course, sir. Let me just see what's going on," she said, her voice a little too bright. She turned to Jamal, her tone softening. "Hi there. Could I just see your boarding pass, please?" Jamal, his cheeks now tinged with a flush of humiliation, handed it to her. His hands were trembling slightly. All he had wanted was a quiet flight to read and draw. Now he was the center of a very public spectacle. Karen examined the pass. Her eyes widened slightly. The ticket was legitimate, Seat 2B First Class. The name read Jamal Hayes. The purchase was made with a corporate card, an Amex Black Centurion card, no less under the name Eleanor Vance. The file attached to the booking had a high-priority non-interference note, something she'd only seen for federal air marshals or VIP government officials. Her blood ran cold. This was not a simple mistake. She handed the pass back to Jamal. "Well, sir," she said, turning back to Richard, choosing her words carefully. "The ticket seems to be perfectly valid. The young man is in his assigned seat." Richard scoffed a disbelieving guttural sound. "Valid." Karen looked at him. "Be realistic. Do you really think he belongs here? It's far more likely your system has made an error or that he's holding a fraudulent document." He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was still audible to everyone in the first 3 rows. "We have to be careful these days. Security is paramount. For all we know, he could be a threat." The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Jamal flinched as if he'd been struck. A threat. He was a 17-year-old kid with a sketchbook full of architectural drawings and a love for science fiction. He had never been in a fight in his life. "Sir, I can assure you," Karen began, but Richard cut her off. "No, you can't assure me of anything." He snapped, his voice rising again. "I pay over $50,000 a year to this airline for the privilege of a peaceful, secure, and exclusive travel experience. I am not going to sit for 6 hours next to someone who has clearly gamed the system. Either he goes, or I will be filing the most significant complaint you have ever seen against both you personally and this airline. I will be speaking with my contacts on the board of Transcontinental. Do you understand what I'm saying?" He was leveraging his power, twisting a simple flight attendant's arm with the full weight of his corporate influence. Karen looked from Richard's furious, reddening face to Jamal's quiet, wounded one. She was caught in an impossible position. On one hand, she had airline policy, a valid ticket, and a high-priority note she didn't fully understand. On the other, she had a premier customer threatening her livelihood and invoking the specter of a security threat, a magic word that could override almost any other protocol. Her training was screaming at her to stand her ground and protect the passenger in the right. But her fear, the very human fear of losing her job, was screaming louder. She was only 24, still paying off student loans, and a complaint from Richard Davenport could get her grounded or worse, fired. She made a decision, a terrible, cowardly decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Sir," she said to Jamal, her voice barely a whisper, "I am so sorry, but there does appear to be some confusion with the seating. Would you mind if we found you another comfortable seat in the main cabin for now? Just while we sort this out?" The phrase "sort this out" was a lie, and they all knew it. There was nothing to sort out. This was an expulsion. Jamal stared at her, his initial confusion hardening into a quiet, dignified hurt. He could see the fear in her eyes. He could feel the weight of every other passenger's stare. He could fight. He could argue, show his ticket again, demand to see her supervisor. But he could also see where this was going. It would become a bigger scene. They might call security. They might delay the flight. He would be painted as the aggressor, the angry black man, causing a disturbance. His mother had always taught him to pick his battles, to stay calm and composed, to never let anyone else's ugliness become his own. With a slow, deliberate movement, he packed his book and sketchbook into his backpack. He didn't look at Richard. He didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing the tears welling in his eyes. He stood up, his tall frame seeming to shrink under the pressure of the cabin's scrutiny. "It's fine," he said, his voice clipped and quiet. He slung his backpack over his shoulder. "Where do you want me to go?" Relief washed over Karen's face, quickly followed by a wave of shame. "Thank you so much for your understanding," she mumbled, avoiding his eyes. "Right this way. We have a middle seat in row 32. A middle seat. From a first-class window seat to an economy middle seat. The humiliation was absolute. As Jamal walked down the aisle, the curtain separating the classes felt like a guillotine, severing him from a world he had, for a few brief moments, been a part of. Richard Davenport watched him go, a smug, satisfied smile playing on his lips. He leaned back in his now spacious seating area, spreading his arms out over the empty seat next to him. He had restored order. He had protected the integrity of his sanctuary. He took another sip of his macchiato. It tasted like victory. He flagged down Karen as she returned, her face pale. "Thank you, Karen," he said smoothly, as if he were commending her for a job well done. "You made the right call. I'll be sure to mention your excellent customer service in my feedback." Karen just nodded, unable to speak, and quickly retreated to the galley, the weight of what she had just done settling upon her like a lead blanket. The door to the aircraft was sealed, the jet bridge pulled away, and the plane began its slow taxi toward the runway. For Richard, the unpleasantness was over. The flight could now begin. For the next 20 minutes, Richard basked in his triumph. He stretched his legs out, relishing the extra space. He ordered a glass of Glenlivet, 18, a pre-takeoff indulgence he felt he had thoroughly earned. He made a point of smiling warmly at the older woman in 3A, who smiled back, a shared look of relief passing between them. They were the guardians of this space, the rightful inhabitants. The brief disruption had only served to reinforce their sense of belonging. He pulled out his phone, firing off a quick, boastful email to a colleague. "You won't believe the nerve of some people. Had to have a freeloader removed from my row." The entitlement is off the charts these days. Handled it, of course. He hit send with a flourish, feeling a surge of self-satisfaction. The plane taxied to a remote section of the tarmac, and then stopped. The engines whined down to a low idle. This was unusual. Typically, they would join the queue for takeoff. Richard glanced out the window, seeing only empty concrete and a few distant service vehicles. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Folks, this is Captain Miller, up in the cockpit. We seem to have a slight ground delay. Air traffic control has put us in a temporary hold. We shouldn't be here for too long. We'll get you on your way to Los Angeles as soon as we can. Sit tight." A collective groan rippled through the aircraft. Delays were a tedious but common part of air travel. Richard sighed, annoyed. He had a 2 p.m. conference call he couldn't miss. Still, he was comfortable. He had his scotch, he had his space, and he had his victory. He could wait. 15 minutes turned into 30. The cabin grew stuffy. Flight attendants offered another round of drinks, their smiles looking increasingly strained. Richard's good mood began to curdle into impatience. He checked his watch for the 10th time. This was ridiculous. Back in row 32. Seat E. Jamal was wedged between a heavy-set man who had already fallen asleep and was snoring loudly, and a woman who was frantically texting, her elbows jutting into his space. The indignity of the situation was a physical weight. He had gone from a luxurious pod with ample legroom to a space so cramped his knees were pressed hard against the seat in front of him. He tried to read his book, but the words swam before his eyes. The scene in first class replayed in his mind on a loop, Richard's condescending tone the flight attendant's fearful eyes the stares of the other passengers. He felt small, powerless, and deeply, profoundly embarrassed. He wanted to call his mom, but they were instructed to keep phones on airplane mode. His mom, Eleanor. She would be furious, not just because of the blatant racism, but because of the breach of protocol. She was a stickler for rules and fairness. She was the one who taught him to always carry himself with dignity, to know his rights. He felt like he had let her down by not fighting harder. He sank lower in his seat, the snoring from his neighbor, a grating soundtrack to his misery. Up front, Richard's patience had finally snapped. He hit the call button again. Karen appeared, her face a mask of professional dread. "What is the meaning of this delay, Karen?" he demanded. "Is anyone flying this plane? I have a schedule to keep." "I'm very sorry, Mr. Davenport. The captain just informed us that we're waiting for a final operational clearance, a routine inspection," she explained, though the explanation felt thin even to her. They'd already done all the pre-flight checks. This felt different. An inspection. Now Richard scoffed. Unacceptable. "Tell the captain that Richard Davenport, in 2A, is extremely displeased. This airline's efficiency is becoming a joke." Before Karen could respond, the captain's voice came over the intercom again, and this time it had a distinctly different tone. The folksy charm was gone, replaced by a formal, clipped cadence. "Good morning, passengers. This is Captain Miller again. Apologies for the continued delay. Per FAA regulations, we are holding at the gate to allow for a mandated ramp inspection to be completed. We are required to cooperate fully. We ask for your continued patience. FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration." That was a name that carried weight. Even Richard knew you didn't argue with the FAA. A ripple of nervous murmuring went through the cabin. This was no longer a standard delay. Suddenly, the main cabin door hissed open. The chilly jet fuel-scented air of the tarmac flooded in for a moment. 2 ground crew members appeared, followed by a woman. She was not a flight attendant. She wore a sharp, dark blue business suit with a crisp white shirt. Her shoes were practical, polished flats that made no sound on the cabin floor. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, immaculate bun. She carried a tablet and a grim expression. Her eyes, sharp and analytical, swept over the first-class cabin, taking in every detail with an unnerving intensity. There was an aura of absolute, unshakable authority about her. She walked directly to the front galley and spoke in a low, firm voice to the lead flight attendant and Karen, who had hurried over. Richard couldn't hear what was being said, but he could see the color drain from Karen's face. The lead attendant was nodding rapidly, looking terrified. The woman in the suit then turned her gaze to the passengers. Her eyes scanned the rows 1A, 1B, 1D, then 2A. Her eyes met Richard's for a brief, cold moment. Then they flicked to the empty seat beside him, 2B. Her expression didn't change, but a subtle tightening around her jaw told a story of its own. Richard felt an unfamiliar sensation, a flicker of genuine unease. This woman was not someone to be trifled with. He sat up straighter, instinctively adjusting his tie, as if preparing for an audit. He assumed this was about the delay, some bureaucratic nonsense that was ruining his day. He had no idea that the storm he had so carelessly created was about to break directly over his head. The woman in the suit stepped out of the galley and into the aisle of the first-class cabin. The low chatter among the passengers died instantly. All eyes were on her. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the cabin's tense silence. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I am an aviation safety inspector with the Federal Aviation Administration. The title landed with the force of a physical blow. FAA. This was serious. This wasn't a customer service issue. This was a federal matter. Eleanor's gaze swept across the cabin again, methodical and unblinking. We have been alerted to a potential compliance issue on this flight, specifically regarding passenger seating protocols and crew response. I am here to conduct a formal review before this aircraft is cleared for departure. Richard shifted in his seat. A seating protocol issue. A part of him felt a perverse sense of validation. He had been right all along. The issue with the boy in 2B was a genuine problem so significant that it had triggered a federal inspection. He felt a swell of pride. Richard Davenport, had identified a security lapse that even the airline had missed. He was a hero. Eleanor Vance took a slow walk down the aisle. She stopped beside row 2. She looked at Richard in seat 2A, then at the empty seat 2B. According to the flight manifest I have here, she said, glancing at her tablet. Seat 2B is assigned to a passenger named Jamal Hayes. I do not see him here. Can anyone tell me where Mr. Hayes is? A thick, uncomfortable silence descended. Richard, puffed up with self-importance, saw his moment to take charge to explain the situation to this competent, no-nonsense inspector. He cleared his throat. Inspector Vance, he said, his voice smooth and authoritative. Richard Davenport, I can shed some light on that. There was a bit of a situation earlier. The young man you're referring to was, in my opinion, a potential security risk. He didn't seem to belong here, and his presence was making several of us uncomfortable. He gestured vaguely at the other passengers, trying to draw them into his narrative. I brought it to the attention of the flight attendant, and she very wisely resolved the matter by moving him to a seat in the main cabin. He smiled, expecting a nod of approval, perhaps even a word of thanks for his vigilance. Eleanor Vance did not smile back. Her expression remained glacially neutral. She turned her head slowly, pinning Karen, the flight attendant, with an icy stare. Karen, who had been hovering near the galley, looked like she was about to faint. Flight attendant Eleanor said, her voice dropping a decibel, yet gaining an edge of steel. "What is your name, Karen Fisher, ma'am?" she stammered. "Ms. Fisher." Eleanor continued. "Did you, in your capacity as a crew member of this flight, remove a ticketed confirmed first-class passenger from his assigned seat, based on the complaint of another passenger?" Karen's eyes darted nervously towards Richard, then back to Eleanor. She was trapped. Lying to an FAA inspector was a career-ending, potentially criminal offense. "Well, Mr. Davenport is a Diamond Medallion member, and he expressed a security concern, and I just thought it would be best to de-escalate the situation by—" "That is not what I asked," Eleanor cut in, her voice sharp as glass. "I will ask again. Did you remove the passenger in seat 2B, Jamal Hayes, against his will?" Tears welled in Karen's eyes. "Yes," she whispered the word, barely audible. "Yes, I did." Eleanor made a note on her tablet, with a swift, angry tap of her stylus. Then she turned her full, undivided attention to Richard. Her gaze was so intense, it felt like a physical weight, pressing him back into his expensive leather seat. "Mr. Davenport," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You stated that the passenger in 2B made you uncomfortable. Could you please elaborate on the specific actions he took that led you to this conclusion? Did he threaten you? Did he use loud or abusive language? Did he refuse to comply with crew instructions? What precisely was the nature of the security risk he posed?" Richard suddenly felt like a witness under cross-examination. His easy confidence began to evaporate under her piercing stare. "Well, no, not. Not explicitly," he stammered, his well-oiled rhetoric failing him for the first time in years. It was more his demeanor. He didn't fit the profile of a first-class passenger. His clothing, his age. It was clear there was a mistake. "I was merely pointing out a discrepancy." "A discrepancy." Eleanor repeated, one eyebrow arching slightly. "So you profiled him. You made an assumption about him based on his appearance and his race, and you decided he didn't belong. Is that an accurate summary of your vigilance?" The word race hung in the air. Richard paled. He had been so careful to frame it as a security issue, a matter of class and decorum. But this woman had stripped away his euphemisms and laid his prejudice bare for everyone to see. "Now see here, I resent that implication." He blustered, trying to regain control. "This has nothing to do with race. It has to do with airline policy and paying customers' rights. I am a paying customer. A very good one, I might add." "Indeed," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Your status as a paying customer gives you the right to your assigned seat and the services you paid for. It does not give you the right to harass other passengers. It does not give you the right to interfere with a flight crew's duties. And it certainly does not give you the right to unlawfully discriminate against a child and have him removed from a seat that he or someone on his behalf also paid for." She took a step closer, her voice lowering into a menacingly calm tone. "You see, Mr. Davenport, I know for a fact that Jamal Hayes's ticket was valid. I know it was paid for in full. I know he was in his correct assigned seat. I know he did absolutely nothing to warrant the treatment he received today." Richard stared at her, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. How could she be so certain? Who was this woman? Eleanor Vance gave a small, cold smile. It did not reach her eyes. "I know all of this," she said, letting the words hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final devastating blow. "Because I am the one who bought him the ticket. You see, Mr. Davenport, you didn't just harass a random passenger. You didn't just intimidate a flight attendant into breaking federal regulations." She paused, her eyes locking onto his. "You kicked my son out of his seat." The revelation dropped into the silent cabin like a bomb. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the low hum of the auxiliary power unit. Richard Davenport's face, which had been a mask of indignant rage, crumbled into a canvas of pure, unadulterated shock. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked from Eleanor's stony face to the empty seat beside him, the space where Jamal had been, and back again. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The high-priority note on the booking. The sudden, inexplicable FAA inspection. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a reckoning. The other passengers who had been watching the drama unfold with a mixture of fear and fascination now stared at Richard with open contempt. The older woman who had shared a complicit smile with him now looked at him as if he were something she'd scraped off her shoe. The businessman in 2D finally looked up from his laptop, shaking his head in disgust. Richard was no longer a hero enforcing order. He was a bully who had been caught. Eleanor Vance let the weight of her words settle before she continued. Her professionalism was a weapon far more effective than any shouting match could ever be. She was not just an angry mother. She was an FAA inspector on the job, and she was building her case brick by methodical brick. She turned to her left, addressing the entire first-class cabin. "For the record, she announced, her voice ringing with authority. My son Jamal Hayes is 17 years old. He is on his way to a pre-college summer program at the California Institute of Technology. I purchased this first-class ticket for him as a high school graduation present. His presence in this cabin was not a mistake, a security threat, or a discrepancy. It was a gift from his mother. She then turned back to Karen, the flight attendant, whose face was now streaked with tears. Eleanor's tone softened slightly, but the steel remained. Ms. Fisher, I need your official statement. Did Mr. Davenport at any point threaten your job or the airline's reputation if you did not comply with his demand to move my son? Karen nodded miserably. He said he would file a major complaint against me and the airline. He said he had contacts on the board. I was scared, ma'am. I'm so sorry. I know I should have called the purser or the captain, but he was so aggressive. I understand, Eleanor said, though it was clear this understanding did not imply forgiveness. She made another note on her tablet. Your fear, however, does not absolve you of your responsibility to follow federal regulations which strictly prohibit the reseating of a passenger due to discrimination. You will be required to attend a formal debriefing upon our return to the gate. Your actions today will be under review. With Karen's fate provisionally sealed, Eleanor pivoted back to the architect of the entire fiasco. Richard Davenport had shrunk in his seat. The bravado, the arrogance, the sense of untouchable entitlement, it had all bled out of him, leaving behind a pale, sweating man who looked years older than he had an hour ago. Mr. Davenport. Eleanor began, and the way she said his name made it sound like an accusation. Let me educate you on a few things. First, Title 49 of the United States Code of Federal Regulations, specifically the part about interfering with the duties of a flight crew member. By intimidating Miss Fisher into moving another passenger, you did just that. That is a federal offense punishable by fines of up to $25,000 and in some cases imprisonment. Richard flinched. The numbers were ones he understood. This was no longer a social faux pas. This was a serious financial and legal liability. Second, she continued relentless transcontinental air, like all airlines operating in the United States, has a strict federally mandated anti-discrimination policy. You coerced a crew member into violating that policy. That opens both you and the airline up to significant civil litigation. I imagine the airline's lawyers will be very interested to hear about that. She took a step closer, lowering her voice, so only he and the nearby passengers could hear. But third and most importantly on a personal level, you humiliated a child. My child. You profiled him, bullied him, and subjected him to public degradation. Because in your small, narrow world, you couldn't fathom the idea that a young black man could possibly belong in your space. You didn't see a kid with a book. You saw a threat. You didn't see a passenger. You saw a problem. And you did it all with a smug sense of righteousness. Her voice was devoid of emotion, which made her words cut even deeper. People like you, Mr. Davenport, are the reason my son has to walk through the world with a shield up. People like you are why I have to have conversations with him that other parents don't. But you made a mistake today. You thought he was alone. You thought he was powerless. You were wrong. She straightened up and addressed the lead flight attendant. Purser, please retrieve Mr. Hayes from the main cabin and escort him back to his assigned seat 2B. And please bring him a glass of your best sparkling apple cider. and my sincerest apologies on behalf of the FAA for what he has just endured." The purser, a steely-eyed older woman who had been watching the entire scene with grim satisfaction, nodded sharply. "With pleasure, Inspector." As the purser headed back through the curtain, Eleanor Vance looked at Richard one last time. "As for you, Mr. Davenport, you will not be flying to Los Angeles today. Your continued presence on this aircraft is a security concern." She used his own words against him, twisting the knife. "Your actions have created a hostile and disruptive environment, and you have proven yourself to be a liability. Captain Miller has already been instructed to return to the gate. You will be deplaned and met by airport security." The finality in her voice was absolute. This was not a negotiation. It was a verdict. Richard Davenport, the titan of finance, the man who moved markets and fired people with a single email, was being kicked off a plane. And the whole world, or at least the 10 other people in first class, was watching. The taxi back to the gate was the longest 15 minutes of Richard Davenport's life. The plane, which had felt like his personal kingdom just an hour earlier, now felt like a prison cell on wheels. He sat ramrod straight, staring forward, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The silence in the cabin was deafening, broken only by the quiet hum of the plane. He could feel the weight of every set of eyes on him. He was no longer a figure of power. He was a spectacle of shame. The curtain from economy rustled, and the purser returned, followed by Jamal. The boy's eyes were a little red, but he held his head high. He looked at his mother, and a silent, powerful communication passed between them, a mixture of relief, pride, and love. He walked past Richard's seat without a single glance, and slipped back into 2B, as if he had never left. He placed his sketchbook on the tray table, a quiet act of reclaiming his space. The plane finally docked at the gate with a gentle bump. The seatbelt sign pinged off, but no one moved. Everyone was waiting. Eleanor Vance nodded to the purser, who walked over to Richard. "Sir," the purser said, her voice firm and professional. "Please gather your belongings. We have arrived at the gate." Slowly, as if moving underwater, Richard stood up. He pulled his expensive leather briefcase from the overhead bin, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. He avoided looking at Jamal. He avoided looking at Eleanor. He just wanted to disappear. As he stepped into the aisle, 2 uniformed Port Authority officers appeared at the open cabin door. They were large, imposing figures, their expressions impassive. They were not there to arrest him. Not yet, anyway, but to ensure his compliant removal from the aircraft. Their presence was the final undeniable stamp of his humiliation. Eleanor stood near the doorway, her arms crossed, watching his approach. She was no longer an inspector in that moment, but a mother seeing justice done for her son. As Richard drew level with her, he stopped. He had to say something. The silence was eating him alive. I'm sorry." He mumbled the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. It was a misunderstanding. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes cold. "No, Mr. Davenport. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice. You chose to be cruel. You chose to be arrogant. You chose to see the worst in someone. And now you have to live with the consequences of that choice. A misunderstanding is when you accidentally take the wrong black suitcase from the carousel. What you did was an act of deliberate prejudice. Do not insult my intelligence or your own by calling it anything less." She stepped aside, clearing his path to the jet bridge and the waiting officers. "Have a good day, Mr. Davenport." His walk off the plane was a blur. He could feel the stares of the passengers in the rows he passed. He could hear a smart phone camera click somewhere behind him. The story was already starting to travel. Out on the jet bridge, one of the officers said, "This way, sir," and gestured toward the terminal. They didn't touch him, but their presence was a cage. As he was being escorted away, Flight 815 from JFK to LAX finally received its clearance. The new flight crew brought in to replace the compromised ones, prepared for departure. Jamal now settled comfortably in seat 2B, with a glass of sparkling cider, opened his sketchbook. He looked out the window as the ground crew pushed the plane back once more. He saw a small, pathetic figure in a tailored suit being led into a security office by 2 police officers. He didn't feel joy or triumph. He just felt tired. But he also felt a deep, swelling pride in his mother. She hadn't screamed or yelled. She had simply used the power she had earned the system she believed in to make things right. He turned to a fresh page in his sketchbook. At the top, he wrote the date. Then he began to draw. He drew the wing of the plane soaring high above the clouds, leaving the ugliness of the world far below. The consequences for Richard Davenport did not end when he was escorted into the sterile quiet of the Port Authority security office. That sterile, windowless room was merely the antechamber to his new life, a purgatory where his old one was officially pronounced dead. The officers were polite, their questions perfunctory. They were not charging him with a crime. Their purpose was simply to document the in-flight incident and ensure he vacated airport property without further disruption. He was a piece of problematic cargo that had been offloaded, and they were the baggage handlers. Stripped of his authority, his threats meaningless, he answered their questions in a monotone, the fight having completely drained out of him. He was issued a formal citation for disorderly conduct, and then released into the chaotic thrum of the departures hall at JFK, a ghost haunting the place where his power had once been absolute. His first instinct was to get home. He pulled out his phone to have his assistant book him the next flight to Los Angeles. First class, of course. Then he remembered. He no longer had an assistant to call upon for such matters. He was on his own. He navigated to the Transcontinental Air app, the familiar blue icon, a symbol of his status, and tried to book a ticket. "Your account has been suspended, pending review." A red banner at the top of the screen announced the airline had already severed ties. The speed of it was breathtaking. He was forced to walk briefcase in hand to the counter of a budget airline, a carrier he'd previously only known from jokes made by his colleagues. He paid an exorbitant last-minute fare for a non-reclining middle seat in the last row next to the lavatories. The 6-hour flight back to LAX was a special kind of hell, a tailor-made punishment for his sins. Wedged between 2 strangers, his knees crammed against the seat in front of him, the recycled air thick with the scent of disinfectant, he was a king exiled to the peasantry. Every clink of the service cart, every polite offer of a drink to the passengers in the front of the plane, was a fresh reminder of the world he had lost. He was now invisible, just another face in the crowd, and the anonymity was more suffocating than any first-class cabin could ever be. He arrived at his Bel Air mansion late that night, the sprawling estate feeling less like a home and more like a mausoleum. He poured himself a large glass of scotch and sank into a leather armchair, the silence of the house pressing in on him. He finally dared to look at his phone, which had been buzzing incessantly. There were dozens of missed calls, hundreds of texts and emails. And then he saw it. A friend had sent him a link with the simple message, "You need to see this." It was a TikTok video. The angle was shaky, filmed from a few rows back, but the subjects were unmistakable. He watched himself, his face contorted in an ugly sneer of indignation. He heard his own voice, arrogant and condescending. Then he watched Eleanor Vance, calm and lethal, as she dismantled his entire world with a few precisely chosen sentences. The climax of the video was her devastating line, "You kicked my son out of his seat." The clip ended, and the view count was already in the millions. Below it, the comments section was a torrent of digital vitriol, a tsunami of hatred directed entirely at him. He clicked on a trending hashtag, #Davenport deplaned. There were memes. His face was photoshopped onto movie villains. People had found his LinkedIn profile, his corporate headshot, now a symbol of entitled bigotry. Then he found the blog post by Mark Chen, the businessman from Seat 2D. It was titled, "I watched a man's privilege crash and burn at 30,000 feet, and it laid out the entire incident in excruciating minute-by-minute detail, painting him not just as a racist, but as a pathetic, power-hungry bully. The true corporate fallout began at 6 a.m. the next morning, with a call from Jonathan Sterling's executive assistant. Her voice, usually warm and deferential, was now as cold and sharp as chipped ice. "Mr. Sterling expects to see you in the New York boardroom at 9 a.m. tomorrow. A car will be waiting for you." It wasn't a request. The next 24 hours were a blur of shame. Another red-eye flight in coach, another journey through the circles of his personal hell. When he walked into the hallowed halls of Sterling Cooper Financial, the building where he was once a titan, the receptionists wouldn't meet his eyes. Whispers followed him down the corridor. The boardroom was full. The entire senior partnership was there, their faces grim. Jonathan Sterling, a man whose family had run the firm for 3 generations, sat at the head of the table. He didn't invite Richard to sit. Richard Sterling began, his voice laced with a weary disappointment that was somehow worse than anger. "We have a problem, a very public problem. I've been on the phone since 5 a.m. with the trustees of the California Teachers Pension Fund. They are concerned. The New York Firefighters Union is threatening to pull their portfolio. Our PR firm is in full meltdown." Richard opened his mouth to speak, to offer the excuses he'd been rehearsing all night. "Jonathan, it was a misunderstanding. The video has no context. I was tired, I was stressed, I acted poorly." But nothing. Richard Sterling cut him off, his voice hardening. "There is no context that makes this acceptable. We live in a world of optics, and the optics of this are catastrophic. A senior officer of this firm on a recorded video bullying a child based on his race. It doesn't matter what your intent was. The damage is done." He slid a termination letter across the polished mahogany table. "We're invoking the conduct detrimental clause of your contract. Your tenure at Sterling Cooper is over effective immediately. Security will escort you to your office to retrieve your personal belongings. You have 10 minutes, and just like that, it was done. 30 years of ruthless climbing, of backstabbing and deal-making, all erased." As he was walked out of the building carrying a single cardboard box with a few photos and a desk clock, he passed the newsstands in the lobby. His face was on the cover of the New York Post. The days that followed were an avalanche of consequences. The formal registered letter from Transcontinental Air arrived informing him of his lifetime ban. Another envelope, this one bearing the seal of the Federal Aviation Administration, contained the official notice of his $18,500 fine. Each letter was a paper tombstone for a part of his life he had taken for granted. His golf club membership was suspended indefinitely. Invitations to charity galas were quietly rescinded. Friends stopped returning his calls. He was a social leper, a toxic asset in a world that only valued pristine reputations. The final, most crushing blow came a month later. He was sitting alone in his vast, empty living room, the television off, the silence a roaring in his ears. The mail arrived, and among the bills and junk mail was a thick, creamy envelope from a prestigious law firm. It was a civil lawsuit filed on behalf of Eleanor Vance and her son Jamal Hayes. He braced himself for a multi-million-dollar demand. But as he read the document, a cold dread different from anything he'd felt before washed over him. They were suing him for a nominal symbolic sum for defamation and emotional distress. The document explicitly stated that any and all damages awarded by the court would be donated in their entirety to the Equal Justice Initiative, an organization committed to fighting racial inequality. It was a masterstroke. This wasn't about money. He could have fought a battle of money. This was a battle for his soul, and he had already lost. It was a final, indelible judgment, ensuring that the story of his downfall would not just be a viral moment, but a permanent legal precedent of his prejudice. It was a form of karma so precise, so elegantly constructed, that it offered him no escape. He was left with nothing but his cavernous house, his scotch, and the echoing memory of his own poisoned words, a self-inflicted wound that would never, ever heal. The story of Richard Davenport is a powerful and sobering reminder that the world is smaller than we think, and the consequences of our actions can be far-reaching and devastating. It shows us that prejudice and arrogance, no matter how much wealth or status you use to disguise them, will eventually be exposed. In this case, justice wasn't just served. It was delivered with surgical precision by a mother whose power came not from anger, but from her unwavering professionalism and her position within the very system the man tried to manipulate. This story reminds us of the importance of standing up against injustice, whether you are a witness, a victim, or like Eleanor Vance, a quiet force for good. What did you think of the way Eleanor handled the situation? Do you believe the karma Richard received was fitting for his actions? We want to hear your thoughts and your stories. Have you ever witnessed a moment like this? Share your experience in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories of karma, justice, and the human condition. Thank you for listening.